Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's LIDNUG presentation. Today we are proud to bring you Sahil Malik on his presentation on AngularJS, Azure AD and Office 365. As always, we are always grateful to the help we get from our sponsors, Orcsweb, Telerik, Inner Working, Syncfusion, Pluralsight and Winterlect Now, who are always here to help us. And without the support of you guys, we can't do what we do. LIDNUG does have a varied presence across all social media. You can find us, of course, on LinkedIn, also Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Google, and we do have a website, which is soon to be updated. Keep an eye out for our future events. And our next event, which is a big one, we have our 18th presentation from Scott Guthrie himself. And come along, ask him questions, and he'll fire the answers straight back at you. It's definitely a great one to come along to, that one. Today, of course, as I said, we're bringing you Sahil Malik, and he's a Microsoft MVP, the founder of WinSmart. He is a blogger, and there's plenty there to look at. He's certainly a respected author there. You can find him on Twitter if you have any questions to ask him, and he's a proud owner of a Tesla S. Very impressive bit of machinery that is. For those of you new to live meeting, the question system is, if you want to ask a question, open the Q&A button at the top. The system allows you to enter one question, and as we've just spoken out with Sahil, we'll take the questions and we'll ask those questions at the end of the presentation. If you do need any questions about the session itself, all LIDNUG staff have the LIDNUG in the square brackets. If you find them in the attendees list, double-click the name and you can ask them questions directly there. Our attendee geography today is very spread out there, from all the way from the east coast of America all the way to New Zealand there it's looking at. And that's the end of my bit, so Sahil Malik, I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you, Brian. Or, sorry, it was Gavin.
Always.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for attending this session. So this session is about using JavaScript-based technologies when writing apps for Office 365. And the things that I'm going to cover in this session are, assuming that you have some knowledge of JavaScript and AngularJS, how can you use those to create applications for Office 365? The concepts I'm going to cover here are Azure AD and Office 365. I'm not going to be covering the basics of JavaScript and AngularJS itself, so I assume that you already know that. A little bit about me. I'm a hands-on techie, been an MVP for a few years, written a few books, etc. You can Google for me or catch me online, talking about JavaScript, iOS, and Microsoft everything. So a little bit of background about why this session is an important thing that we should learn is because JavaScript was this language that was created in 1994, intended to write no more than 100-line programs by a called Brendan Eich. And the theory was that they were going to compete with Microsoft, and they were going to create this browser called Netscape, and they were going to charge everybody $30 a month. And the theory was that everybody around the world will use Netscape Navigator, and these guys will become billionaires. But on the other hand, there was this other company called Sun Microsystems. They created this thing called Java that was trying to do almost the same thing, that is killing Microsoft by making the operating system, irrelevant. These two guys, they joined hands eventually, and they ended up calling, they had two technologies to solve the same problem. The problem being, let's get rid of Microsoft. And they needed a better name for this technology, so they called it JavaScript. And that unfortunate choice has been confusing recruiters ever since. So Java and JavaScript, you guys are technical, so you know that they're completely different. But why has JavaScript become so important lately? Sometimes I see these, things floating around the internet in which people show that, here's a SD card that is 256 megabytes, another SD card that is 256 gigabytes. In a span of 5 years, the capacity has increased 1,000 times. That's very impressive. But what people, don't brag about as much is how much have JavaScript, the engines, JavaScript engines, their performance, how much has their performance improved by? Over the last few years, JavaScript engines, their performance has improved by more than 1 million times. So 3 times as much as storage. The JavaScript has become very, very important. Number one, that right now it offers you the speed of compiled languages like C#, but it offers you the flexibility of interpreted languages. Now, there are a lot of problems with JavaScript also. I have an article coming up in Code Magazine called WTF.js. It should be out within the next 15 days, in which I've basically shown the most common mistakes people make when writing JavaScript. And it's just mind-blowing how confusing this language can be. But in the last few years, we've also seen platform defragmentation. People are using all sorts of devices. 10 years ago, I had a desktop. 5 years ago, I had a desktop and a laptop. Today, you have a desktop, laptop, smartwatch, couple of tablets, a phone, all sorts of stuff. And as Gavin mentioned, that I got this new fancy car, and that car runs JavaScript. It's just amazing that JavaScript is the only language that runs all the way from your phone, or rather even from your watch, all the way to the desktop. So if you're writing apps for the Pebble watch, for instance, the API for that is JavaScript. So it runs everywhere, and because every developer can apply, it has a huge community support. And right now it is expanded beyond the browser too. So beyond the browser, there's something called as Node.js. It runs everywhere. It is sort of becoming, the technology like Gulp, Grunt, etc., that are built on top of Node. And this is a technology that is, well set into the computing history now, and, it's something that we have to learn. And these are a couple of things that I've been blogging about recently as well, that Microsoft released this tool called Visual Studio Code, which is based on Atom.io, which is written using JavaScript. And that can be used to write, amazing stuff. And this is how we're going to develop in the future. So Visual Studio 2015 has given up its task runner in favor of Gulp, for instance, right? So these things are becoming very, very important. So that's JavaScript. But unless you were under a very large rock for the last few years, you probably already knew that. Let's talk a little bit about Office 365 also. The on-premises model is being pushed off. We all know that. Now, it's not going to go away. There are a lot of people that are holding on to it dear life. But still, there are a lot of reasons that I feel Office 365 will be successful. And the number one reason for that is licensing costs. If you've been examining the way Microsoft have been structuring licensing and also the features that they've been rolling into Office 365 versus on-premises, it's clear that Office 365 is the new cute puppy that they got, and the old dog that they have, which was on-premises, is about to go to the farm. At least they're trying very hard. So it is Microsoft's cloud-based offering. It's a group of software plus services, includes things like Office, Skype, Exchange, lots of other things. And, it is being successful. So let's say today a lot of people are using Office 365. 3 years from now, 5 years from now, it's only going to be bigger. That's for sure. So getting Office 365 is fairly simple, but, the platform has been designed to support from simple to very complex. So the simplest way is just go to office365.com and sign up for it. And you get what they call as a Microsoft provided identity. It'll something be like username at yourtenant.onmicrosoft.com. And then from there, you can do a crawl, walk, run approach. You can say, well, I don't want to use onmicrosoft.com. I want to use my own domain. Well, then you just buy a domain and register it inside of the name server of Office 365 and you're ready to go. But then you say, well, the username password is still being stored at some database inside of Microsoft, and you'd rather use your own Active Directory. And then you can use tools like DirSync, etc., and combine it with your on-premises Active Directory for single sign-on experience. Now, this particular presentation, before I go much further, what I thought is that a lot of material that you see in Office 365 out there is a lot of GitHub samples, etc., and they've been provided to us with almost like no explanation of the why behind what they're doing. There's plenty of what, but there is no why. And in this presentation, my thought is that I try and use the flip approach, which is try and explain what is the background of all of this, why are we writing code in a certain way, and why it looks the way it does. And then once we see the why, you'll see the what is almost sort of falls out of that. It becomes very easy to understand. Now I mentioned that you sign up for Office 365 in different ways, but no matter how you sign up, you get an Azure Active Directory with it. So what is Azure Active Directory? Azure Active Directory is a comprehensive identity and access management cloud solution. It provides blah, 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 blah. You can read this later. But the way I see Azure AD is when you sign up for Office 365, you're going to get an Azure AD. Your Office 365 subscription lives inside Azure AD. This is how Microsoft manages identity in the cloud, right? And the important thing to know about Azure AD is that it can integrate with your on-premises Active Directory with using ADFS, DoorSync or not, or you can choose not to integrate it. It sort of bridges all the authentication platforms and gives you a consistent way, both for users and for applications, in a platform agnostic way. So the first thing to know about Azure AD is that it is not Active Directory. When we use the word Active Directory, we think of Windows Server Active Directory. When you log on to your work computer every morning, you probably use that identity. It is not a replacement for your on-premises domain controllers, but it can work with on-premises domain controllers. And it does not locally authenticate users and computers in on-premises AD. Now it can federate to that. So you can configure Azure AD to say that my Azure AD trusts my on-premises Windows AD to do the authentication. But that's not the default setup. In fact, the demo I'm about to show you at the very end of this presentation actually does not use this integration. So we'll see that shortly. So the problem was that Microsoft wanted to create Office 365 and they wanted a consistent sign-on experience. And they wanted a consistent experience for developers and apps and APIs. And to solve that problem, they created Azure AD. And over time, Azure AD has grown. So they saw this, and maybe they had this from the very beginning of time. They thought that this product could be bigger than Office 365. So over time, Azure AD grew. A lot of features got added, new protocols got added, more apps got added to it, and also Microsoft opened it up to outside of Microsoft. And actually, you don't even have to be a Dropbox or Cisco web meeting or whatever to use Azure AD. You can register your own web APIs inside of Azure AD. And when you publish your Office 365 based apps, or the new word for that is add-ins to Marketplace, etc., you're using Azure AD in that way. So today, Azure AD is the de facto authentication choice in the Microsoft world, and it is free. So up to 500,000 users, up to most of the features that we usually care for, it is absolutely free. So a lot of people say, is Azure AD good? I'm like, well, it's pretty good and it's free. So it's not a force that I would fight with. And there is a premium version too, if you wanted to run like things like reports, etc. So there is Azure AD free, there's Azure AD basic, and there's Azure AD premium. The obvious question is, why did Microsoft have to invent a whole new technology? What was wrong with the classic Active Directory? The classic Active Directory, the problem with that is it stays inside your walls. Now you might say, well, I have VPN. Well, okay, you have VPN, but a VPN is a network extension technology. It is not a security technology. It is a means to extend the boundaries of your network. So when you're sitting at home, you are practically on the Office network if you're coming in over VPN. And direct access is just another, I call it a flavor of VPN. It sits on the same network stack. So VPN, the problem with VPN is it doesn't scale. We have been trying to stretch AD in all sorts of different ways by establishing trust relationships, by establishing, all sorts of tricks to extend the boundaries of AD, but it's not working. In fact, if you think about it, like you guys are developers, and when you deploy something into production, you plan for a downtime. You take a backup of your production environment, etc., etc., etc. Active Directory is that part of your critical infrastructure that everything relies on, and it cannot go down, and it's very hard to take a backup of. Just think of that for a second. And as a result of that, Active Directory is something in most organizations that is usually stuck into year 2000, year 2003, and hardly anybody has access to it. They try to guard it like crazy for very good reasons. And as a result, this is a very inflexible technology when it comes to scaling for the internet. It's okay for service accounts. It's okay for managing your company assets. It's not good for the internet. So what are the problems with AD? It's too chatty. There's too much chatting going on with the domain controller, not going to work over the internet. It's got a single point of failure. Yes, you can create backup domain controllers, but there is a limit to what you can scale. It is suitable for a single domain and requires live communication, etc. So the question is, so we needed Azure AD. The question is, who's using Azure AD today? And this screenshot is a little old. It shows about 549 applications registered in Azure AD. Actually, right now there are more than 2,500 applications registered in Azure AD, and pretty much like everything you care about, including Google Apps, is available in Azure AD. So imagine the power of this. Imagine that, say, your organization says, hey, we don't want to use Office 365. We'd rather use Google Apps. You can tie Google Apps into Azure AD. So when a new employee joins in and they need access to Citrix, GoToMeeting, Dynamics CRM, Google Apps, etc., through your Active Directory groups and accounts, they are given access to all of those applications. And if that guy gets fired, their access to all of those systems can be immediately revoked. So it's good for a management point of view. It's also good for the user's point of view because they have only one password to remember. I said they have only one password to remember, but that depends on how you set up your Azure AD, because you can just go ahead and sign in for Office 365 and then you have two passwords and two usernames. One username password that Microsoft maintains that looks like Sahil Malik at winsmartsdev.onmicrosoft.com and its own password. And that's one way. The other way is that you can register your domain inside of Azure AD. So I get a user ID called Sahil Malik at winsmarts.com. And that's, crawl, walk, so we're at the walk stage now. And then the third approach is that I can use a winsmart/domain with a domain server that I may have already set up, right? So if you go all the way, you have the ability to have a single username password, and it's really your choice. So you can start slow and then you can, crawl, walk, run, and move forward. So let's talk about, the crawl, walk, run, the run part, where you have only one single user, where one single identity where users want to be able to sign in using, so they don't have multiple username passwords to remember. The simplest way to do that, there's a tool called DirSync. You install DirSync on a domain controller, hopefully not the primary domain controller inside of your AD. A lot of people, what to do is that they set up a domain controller inside of Azure, so they get high availability for free. And using technologies equivalent to VPN, Azure has a lot of technologies to bridge that gap. They are able to provide connectivity to their domain controller. So that's a very common way that people set up DirSync in. And DirSync will basically, every few hours, it will go ahead and sync your username passwords. So it actually doesn't sync the password, it actually syncs a hash of a password, so it's pretty safe. But it syncs all of that information into the cloud. The advantage of this approach, it is a very simple setup. Users have got one username password to remember, but the disadvantage of this approach is, if your user changes on premises, as in say he changed his password, then the sync may not reflect that information immediately. There might be up to a 3-hour gap before the new password takes effect. And that includes for revoking access also. So that's a disadvantage. But this is a very simple setup. A lot of people start with this. So I keep using this word DirSync. What the hell is DirSync? DirSync is this free tool that Microsoft has created that syncs your on-premises identities to the cloud. You can set it up in various ways. It needs SQL Express or SQL Server to run. And you just set it up on a Windows server. So before you run DirSync, there's an Office 365 preparedness tool that Microsoft has provided. And you would basically run that on your domain. It doesn't make any changes to your AD. It doesn't send any information to Microsoft. It'll just give you a report, because not everything that AD allows is allowed in Azure AD, right? So there's a feature parity difference between Azure AD and Windows Server AD. So the Office 365 preparedness tool will give you that report. You fix those problems, and then you run DirSync, right? And it just runs on its own. It's a very simple tool to set up and run. The other way that you can set this up is in which you say, you tell DirSync that do not sync up passwords. Instead, we will use federated sign-in using using Active Directory. So in that case, what you would do is that you would set up an ADFS endpoint. Now, this ADFS endpoint can optionally be backed with an external-facing ADFS proxy open to the internet. And what that means is that if it is open to the internet, then people will be able to sign into your Active Directory using their Active Directory credentials from anywhere in the world. And this sort of setup would be necessary if you want to use mobile apps. And Microsoft is giving out a lot of, these free compelling that work with Office 365. So, it's worth the investment to set this up because you get the ability to sign on using your iPhone to your Active Directory, and that's extremely powerful. And to sweeten the pot, another thing that they're doing is that they're including mobile device management inside of Office 365 Enterprise SKUs for free. Well, it's not free, you pay for the SKU, but still. And that's like incredibly compelling because setting that up yourself 100% on-premises can be very cost prohibitive. So this is why I feel that, once you compare all the costs between on-premises doing everything yourself versus just letting the experts handle it. I think the cloud story is eventually going to win as much as people will try and fight it for many years, which will keep us in business, and that's great. Okay, so the federated sign-in using Active Directory is one way, but remember ADFS 3.0, for instance, supports various authentication endpoints, passive federation, active federation, OAuth. So really, if you have any identity provider, so if you're one of those people that decides not to use Active Directory, which you say you're one of the 0.1% in the world maybe you're a novel network, I don't know. And if you are, then as long as you are able to, expose your authentication endpoints using any standard authentication mechanism, whether it's trust, whether it's federation, whatever, you can consume it inside of Azure AD. And the really cool thing is that you support, one ADFS endpoint, and Azure AD will make it available on all sorts of authentication protocols. So another way to think of Azure AD is that it gives you a consistent way to authenticate both for apps, APIs, and users, right? So it basically bridges all your headache about authentication protocols, etc. And they are also going to add, support for social login in the near future. They blogged about that about 6 months ago, so I don't know when it's coming, but supposedly it's coming. Okay, so coming back to Office 365 again, Azure AD, it's very flexible, and it gives us across all Office 365 tenants and custom applications, it gives us a consistent mechanism to authenticate our applications, right? So let's look at how Azure AD looks like in Office 365. So I'm going to be doing my demos inside of a VM. I'm going to use my, developer subscription. You can go ahead and, sign up for this yourself. They give it away for free as a trial, but they'll bug you with phone calls afterwards. So let me go ahead and sign in. Okay, so this is my Office 365 tenancy. I've logged onto the default developer site over here, and I'm logged in as the Office 365 tenant admin. So I'm going to go ahead and click this button here and go to the admin section. And I'm going to scroll on the left here, okay, and I'm going to look for a link called Azure AD. Now the hardest thing about doing demos for the cloud is they change it all the time. This button is here right now. It might move somewhere else in the future, but just look for it after you sign in the admin area. So the first time you click on that button, it'll take you through a simple sign up process, but since I've already gone through that, it goes ahead and logs me into my Azure AD. It looks like the Azure portal actually, but this is an Azure portal in which the only thing I have is Azure AD, right? And this initial sign up process is really simple. I was able to do it without a user manual, so it has to be simple. So anyway, so it shows me that this is the Azure AD I have in there. I'm going to click on this, and it shows me all the things that are available inside of here. So I have the ability to manage users inside of here. I have only one user in this tenancy. Groups, applications, domains. If I register a custom domain, I would register that inside of here. If I wanted to, integrate that with my on-premises Active Directory. I would do that inside of here. It's actually not very hard to do. And there are a bunch of other features inside of here. I have an article on Code Magazine which describes this portal in detail. I would recommend you check that out. But you see it's pretty awesome because it even does things like multi-factor authentication, etc. Right? It allows you to manage devices and so on and so forth. Anyway, let's go into the applications part because that is the more interesting part. Now, one thing I'll tell you about doing demos for Office 365 is there are like 500 different steps you have to go through, and each one of those steps must be done perfectly. If you screw up on anything, you're in deep shit, just like the mafia. So I've actually set up the entire demo over here, so I'll look into that later, but I'll walk through all the steps as well. So let me go ahead and click on this add button, and it says, hey, I want to add an application. Now there are two choices here. I can either choose to add an application that my organization is developing, or I can choose to add an application from the gallery. So let's go into the gallery first. And as of now, there are about 2,500 applications, and you see here literally like everything that you care for, any big company that cares for, there are scores of things inside of here that are available to us. AWS can be managed via Azure AD. Just think about that. Apple developer can be, it's just crazy that you can manage it. You don't need your regular Apple IDs, etc., to be able to log on to your, this is amazing what you can do with this. But so you can add, third-party applications there, or you can even publish your own applications there if you wanted to. You have to call Microsoft for that. But if you wanted to write your own application that you don't care if it appears here or not, but you wanted to make that available to, your customers, you can do that by clicking this button here, and it says add an application that my organization is developing. And you have two choices here. You got the ability to create a web application or web API and a native client application. Now, this is an important distinction. Besides the distinction of what a web application or web API is, the most important difference between the two is a web application or web API gives you the choice of being single tenant. Okay? What does a single tenant versus multi-tenant application mean? A single tenant versus multi-tenant application means a single tenant application is designed for your company. Okay? So I'm writing the application for my company and I'm going to take the simple route out. If I was to ship this application, put it on the marketplace, it won't work, right? A multi-tenant application, on the other hand, is something that I'm designing for the marketplace as a third-party vendor who's writing a product, and I'm writing a multi-tenant application. And the way I get the access token is a little bit different. Access token is what you need to be able to call the protected resources. I'll get to that in a second. So a web application or web API, you have a choice of making it single tenant or multi-tenant. A native application is always multi-tenant. And this is an important consideration that we'll get into a second. But a web application, you will just specify the name, URL, etc. But here we're actually going to go with a native client application. So I can say sample app. I'm going to click on next. You have to give it a redirect URI. So the way the authentication works is that the actual authentication details are actually handled by libraries. The library is called ADAL, Active Directory Authentication Library. And Microsoft has provided ADAL for literally every platform that you care about, including JavaScript. And that's what we'll be using today. So the redirect URI, the importance of this is that this redirect URI is what the application will redirect to after authentication. So if you are using iOS, a web view will be hosted. You will authenticate using Azure AD, okay? And then you'll be redirected back and the application takes it on from there, right? So this redirect URI is very important. Now, in iOS and Android, you can choose whatever this redirect URI can be. In Windows, Metro apps or whatever the right name for Universal Apps, let's call it that, or Windows Phone apps, the redirect URI is a little special way of getting it, that basically you first register the app in the App Store without publishing it, and then you get the redirect URI, you paste it in there. For JavaScript applications, the redirect URI is where the JavaScript application sits, because JavaScript applications are going to authenticate, so they're going to redirect to Azure AD to authenticate. A web view, or in this case, a web browser will take on the responsibility. It'll authenticate you and it'll redirect you back to where the JavaScript application was. And that is the redirect URI here. So my JavaScript application is actually going to sit over here. So, all right, keyboard wins, right. So my redirect URI is actually going to be this URL here, winsmartsdev.microsoft.com, etc. Right? Let's come back here. I'm going to paste that in here, okay? And if I hit this, complete button, let's go ahead and do it. So I'm going to hit this complete button, and then it basically shows me that this application has been registered. And once this application has been registered, it takes me through this, detail over here, which says this is the redirect URI. Okay, through PowerShell you can change this. This is a client ID. Okay, now this is the identity of your application, and you need to copy paste this because we're going to reference this in our code. And if you're writing a native iOS app, then this is something that you can hard code in your application. Why would you want to hard code it? Because this is the identity to your application. This is a GUID unique to yourself. And this GUID is how Azure AD is going to identify your application. And let's say I put an application in the App Store and you download it, or rather one of your users in your company downloads it. What happens is that Azure AD, because the application is multi-tenant by default, Azure AD is going to identify your application. It's going to say, hey, dear user, do you want to grant this application access to the resources? Okay, and that process is called as user consent. Okay, another word people use for that is a common consent framework. So a user is given, one dialog in which they say, do you want to grant this application access to, the resources? And the user says, sure. Now, you might say, as an administrator, you might say, I don't want this to happen. Okay, as an administrator, I want to control what applications have access to the resources in my Azure AD. After all, you're protecting corporate information with it. Now the answer is that, yeah, this is the difference between user consent and admin consent. And user consent can be, is default, but it can be changed to admin consent. But admin consent is that administrator has to approve every single application before it can be used. Okay? So remember that you're doing more control, but you're taking on more headache. It is possible to automate this through PowerShell though, so there are ways out. Anyway, the other part is that let's say that I have created this application and I've written the code, but what can the application do? The application can only do what it has been configured to be allowed to be able to do, right? So configure this native client application to access web APIs and other applications secured by Azure AD, including the Graph API. Configure it now. So if I click on that, it basically takes me to this configure tab up here. And so if I go back here, basically you go to the sample app and I go to configure. It's the same thing. Gives me the client ID. I can add more than one redirect URI. And actually what's really cool is that I can actually support wildcard redirect URIs. Okay. And this is a big deal because, you remember like SharePoint hosted apps, or what they call as add-ins. They have this huge disadvantage that they cannot support, that they need wildcard redirect URIs, whereas Passive Federation doesn't support wildcard redirect URIs. Another reason why you should not use SharePoint hosted apps. Yeah, some people don't like it when I say that, but here you have the ability to use redirect URIs that are actually wildcard, and that's very, very powerful. You can give it a logo. Users see this during logon. And here is where you can add permissions to the application. Okay, so I can click on add an application, and there are a whole bunch of applications or apps that Microsoft has provided us that you can grant permissions to. So for instance, I am interested in accessing information from SharePoint Online. Now what that lets me do is it lets me access things like, REST API even, or CSOM, so those are things that, and other APIs that become available. Let's see what becomes available to us. So I'm going to click on complete, and this shows up here, and I can say this application has access to the following permissions. So this is actually new. They added the manage metadata also inside of it. You'll see more and more things will be added inside of it over time. So ability to run search queries as a user. So this is extremely powerful because when the user, search is one of those weird things where you need the identity of the user to be able to run the query because the search results are security trimmed. So they've given us the ability to do this, and that's extremely powerful. So a number of other permissions that you can add over here. When you say read user files, you're actually giving permissions to OneDrive, right? So, and when you hit search, for instance, you're searching across OneDrive, you're searching across, so you're using the standard REST API that Microsoft provides, the _API/query. But when you actually issue a search inside of Office 365, you're actually querying, OneDrive in addition to the SharePoint sites, and that's just mind-blowing. So anyway, you can give these various permissions, and another really cool thing here is that you have the ability to register your custom applications here as well, right? So when you register a custom web API, for instance, talking to your custom backend resources, your custom on-premises business of line apps right now, those can also surface inside of here. So a singular API, singular client ID that can talk to both Office 365 and your other custom developed applications, right? And once you do that, you hit save, and your application is basically ready to go. Okay, so let's come back to slides for a little bit and make sure that what I just showed, that we sort of absorb that in our minds. So JavaScript applications in Office 365 and Azure AD, they sit on a web page, okay? And they can work under the user's security context. But this is typically what we've been doing. When you write simple REST and CSOM in SharePoint 2010, that's what we did, as in that you log on to Office 365 or SharePoint, and then you just run REST and CSOM calls. And that still works. But the problem with that is that it doesn't support cores. It cannot integrate, say, OneDrive or whatever REST API doesn't expose. And it cannot integrate your own custom applications that don't even live on the Office 365 domain. So a better way and a more powerful way is to actually be able to leverage, not the user security context, but a different mechanism of authentication. So also JavaScript is a first-class platform now. It can pretty much work like C# or Swift, writing native applications. So JavaScript applications on a web page, as far as Office 365 apps are concerned, are treated like native applications. So they are multi-tenant by default. You ship, and basically they're talking to the same API that an iOS app will. And the way you do that is that you leverage a library called adal.js or adal.js. It's available on GitHub. It has all the authentication nonsense done for you, so you don't have to do that. Now, if you want to do that on your own, you still can. The protocol is documented, and you have the ability to roll up your sleeves and write your own adal.js if indeed, if you find for some reason that the adal.js that Microsoft has provided doesn't cut it for you. And there are actually some scenarios where adal.js, the current release, falls short. For one, I feel it's too much of a black box, and it writes to the console rather than using the logging services, etc. So think of it as a V1 or beta release. I fully expect this adal.js to improve in the future. I certainly hope it does. But right now it's functional, but consider it as a V1 or a beta release. So again, I talked about the difference between native apps and web apps. Native apps are always multi-tenant. Multi-tenant, the difference that makes is when a user downloads the application from the App Store and signs in using their Office 365 credentials, the app asks the user to grant access. And if the user has access to a resource that the app is asking for, then the user can grant the access to the app. Administrators may not like that, so they can turn that off. I've blogged about that at that link down there. And this is the simple PowerShell script you can use to basically block that access. User consent versus admin consent is not ideal. It's either totally off or totally on. It puts a lot of headache on the administrator. Imagine that the users download all sorts of apps from the app stores, and they start to try to use those apps, and they're going to get a weird error. Ideally, it'd be nice if administrators could whitelist certain apps, and the workaround for that is PowerShell. That you can build a process, and administrators can use that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about OAuth and understand these fundamentals as well before we move much further. OAuth is an open standard for authorization. It is secure delegated access to server resources on behalf of the resource owner. You get an access token which, amongst other information, contains claims. Okay? So an access token is a weird long string that you need to include with every request going in, and as long as that access token is valid, your requests will succeed. access tokens can contain claims. One of that claim can be the user information. So an access token can be, a service only or machine only access token, or it can include the user's identity. And access tokens, they have all sorts of other information in them. It's a format called JOT, JWT, and they have information that is like, the access token has been issued by, it is issued for, it is not valid before, it is not valid after, and so on and so forth, right? And because they can contain claims, you can also do roles-based security using these access tokens. What OAuth is not, it is not an authentication standard. It is an authorization standard. So you authenticate somewhere using a different technology, and then you're issued an OAuth access token, able to do authorization, right? So somebody else authenticates you, and you get an identifier claim, and you may have more than one claims also for role-based security, right? A lot of people try to abuse OAuth as user profile. It's a very bad idea to do so for many reasons, performance, and the access token gets really big, so you shouldn't be doing that. So the overall architecture of the application, for all this background, is basically it's going to be a little web page on which some JavaScript and AngularJS code will sit. It's going to make authenticated calls, and this web page is going to basically be the Office 365 web page. It could be another web page if you wanted to, but to keep things simple, I'll just stick it on Office 365. And it is going to work as a registered native app. It is going to use this native app that you're seeing over here. Okay. So the process that I use to register the native app in Azure AD that I showed a moment ago, I basically go through the same process. And this native app has been given rights to access Office 365 resources and optionally other web APIs. Before anything can work, you have to grant some permissions. What I'm going to do is that I've granted permission to read the user's files, so I can execute a simple REST API to be able to make that call. The one important consideration that I haven't mentioned so far is that we're going to use something called as implicit grant. Okay, implicit grant type does not include client authentication, and it relies on the presence of a resource owner. So the user has to be online. So the user has to say, I am granting access to a certain resource. Okay, so it is suitable where the user is logged on, but it is unsuitable for services, right? And in this case, we're going to be using implicit grant. And implicit grant is something that is available on Azure AD, but it is off by default, and you have to turn it on. So let me go ahead and turn it on for my application. The way you do that, you go to your application, you go to the Configure tab, and then you click on this Manage Manifest button, and you click on Download Manifest. And then you open this JSON file. And then you look for something called as OAuth to allow implicit flow, and you change that to true. Okay. And then you go back here, and then you upload that manifest file inside of here again. I think it was this one. Click open and hit OK. And once you do that, that's basically it. Your application is now available to use, OAuth implicit flow. Now, if you wanted to add access to your custom web APIs, you would basically go through the same process, except you would, you would make different edits inside of this JSON file. Okay, so that's OAuth implicit flow. Very important that for native apps you need to be able to do this. So now let's look at a simple demo. So I have already set up the application inside of here. It's called JS app. Okay, and the JS app has got a client ID that starts with a 2, so this is 269. Let's just remember that. I have granted the redirect URI is this, which is this URL up here. Okay, and the application is sitting over here, and I have granted it access over here, as you can see. I've granted it access to enable sign-on read user profiles, and this is the wrong one right here. So read items in all site collections. So that's the access I've granted it, right? So how did I actually go ahead and set this up? Right now it shows that I'm logged in. It shows me my name, prompts me to log out, and it gives me this button here that I can click and it'll actually get the data. We'll see this in a second, but how did I actually set this up? It's actually a lot more boring than you'd think. It is just a simple content editor web part. So I'm going to hit edit this page and I'll show you how I built this. And just hit edit web part. And I've pointed it to, an HTML file that I've uploaded in here at /assets/old365app.html. That's basically it. I wish it was more impressive, but it's not. How did I actually put that in, and what's in those files? I used our rusty, trusty old friend, SharePoint Designer, which I love to hate. Let's open this. Okay. Just give it a second. Now, one thing that is worth mentioning is that SharePoint Designer access is tuned down, or almost to the point that it's turned off in a developer side. So if you're trying to do this at home, go to Site Settings, go to SharePoint Designer Settings right here, and you need to make sure that you check all these boxes once it loads. Come on, SharePoint. SharePoint. Let's go. Here we go. So you have to make sure that you check all these boxes, okay, before you open SharePoint Designer. Anyway, so I've already done that. And because I've done that, I see this all files link here, and obviously you need to be logged in as a site collection admin. You create a folder of your choice. I called it assets. Click here, and I have created a folder called scripts. I put in Angular. I put in adal.js. Adal.js is what I downloaded from GitHub. And I have put this thing called Office 365 app.html. And it is referencing a file called app.js where my custom code is. So let me also go ahead and open that side by side so we can see these side by side. Right. So what are we doing here? We have a module called adal.js app and a controller called adal.js app controller. So that's declared here, adal.js app, and it has a dependency on adal Angular, which is, this is part of adal.js. Then I have an app controller called adal.js app controller, scope HTTP adal authentication service or service is passed into me. I need to specify some configuration to my app where I basically specify the endpoints here, right? And I have to specify the client ID and the tenant ID over here. So remember, this is the 269, right? This is what I got from here. This is the client ID for my registered application. So I put that in here. And then I, basically once I've done that, then all the heavy duty work of authentication is done for me. So I have a couple of buttons here called login, logout, which are basically tied over here. Login, logout, ng click login, logout. I have a welcome user info.profile.given name. So once I log in, I get the user profile information. And also I have this user info.is authenticated. So I'm hiding or showing this section. So if I log out or I haven't logged in yet, then this section will be invisible. You might say, well, why would I ever not be logged in? Because I have to, in order to see this page, I have to be logged in. Now, this is actually one of the shortcomings of adal.js right now. I'll demonstrate that in a second. But anyway, so remember that this is a critical difference that you have to keep in mind. And then I have some code that executes. So when I click on this get data function, something called get data runs, it'll populate a lists variable. And that will show me all the lists that exist inside of my application. And here, as you can see, it is just a simple, get request to /API. This is just a simple REST API. Underscore API web list. This is the same REST CSOM that you've been using for the last, 15 years. No, well, 10 years, 7 years. Okay. So it gets these results as a $scope.list results.data.value, and it will basically just go ahead and populate the results over here. So before I actually run the demo, actually let me go ahead and sign out completely. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and sign in again. And see now, this is the downside that I was telling you, that you actually see a login button. You may say, I've already logged in. Why am I being asked to log in again? And the answer is, well, you've logged in, but the app hasn't logged in. Okay. Now it is possible to make this more SSO by using ADFS. But if you're not using ADFS, then the user has to click, a login button one more time. Sucks, but it's true. Okay. I'm going to open the developer console here so we can actually see what the hell is going on behind the scenes now. So this is one of the things that, adal.js actually writes to the console as so you can know what it's doing, but well, I wish there was a way to turn this off also using a service, whatever, but anyway, that's what it does, but it's helpful right now. So I'm going to click on this login button, and what it just did is that it navigated me to Azure AD, and it actually logged me in using, it logged me in using AngularJS. And if I actually go to the resources tab over here, if I go down here, under local storage, you actually see that it is somewhere here. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, this ADAL, so the access token, somewhere here we should see. Yeah, so the access token is being stored over here along with a whole bunch of other information. You can get to this level of detail if you wanted to, but you don't have to, because AngularJS will abstract all this out for you. In Cordova, or if you're using, not Cordova, but if you're using, ADAL for iOS, for instance, or Android, or, Windows phones, then it'll even manage refresh tokens and lifetime for you. So you really don't have to worry about this. But if you wanted to, you could. You have all this information here. Anyway, let's go here. And I'm going to go ahead and actually show the console again. Where's console? Here. Let's clear this. The resolution is so low that. Okay. So I'm going to click on this Get Data button. And you see here that it is able to execute the call. It hit a debugger because I probably have a debugger statement in there. Do I? Or no, I had a breakpoint here. And it sets this lists value over here. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this, and you see here that it is able to render out all the lists that I have access to inside of the site collection, right? And I'm just using lists over here, but remember you can take this a lot further. You have the ability to tap into the user's emails, the user's link presence information, their calendar. The search graph API, in fact, the Delve application that we've heard of, or the Office Gig Jam that they recently showed, is probably using APIs similar to this behind the scenes. And you can expand this to write your own custom web APIs that can be registered inside of Azure AD. And I've written articles on all of this, and if you're interested in that, shoot me an email and I'll hook you up with the article. Okay, cool. So this is how the whole thing basically works. So that's all for now. Hopefully you found this useful, and if there are any questions, I'd love to take up any questions at this point. Remember, you can catch me on Twitter and Facebook, etc. Just Google for me or just shoot me an email, and this is my Twitter handle and email address. Thank you very much for watching. If there are any questions at this point, I'd love to take them at this time.
Thanks very much, Sahil there. Like I said, if you have any questions now, if you just want to open up your question and answers panel and drop them in there. If Sahil wants to look at them himself, or I can read them out for you and you can answer them directly, it's up to yourself. Just give it a few minutes there. There we go, here's one here from Sahil. I'll open it up. Hard coding client ID is the only way to embed, or do we have an alternative way?
Okay, so that's a very good question. First of all, hard coding a client ID is not a big deal. In fact, it is something you want to do in native apps, right? So it's not a problem to go ahead and hard code the client ID because the GUIDs are free. And when your application is never going to pretend to be another application. So hard coding client IDs is fine in a native app. You do have an alternate way also. You have the ability to query the Azure AD graph, and I actually blogged about that. If you're interested, shoot me an email. I'll hook you the link. You have the ability to query the Azure AD graph, and as long as the user has a right to do that, which almost every user does by default, you have the ability to query the Azure AD graph and read the client IDs also. So that's another thing you can do. But it's okay to hard code client IDs.
Yeah, thank you very much there, Sahil. Anchor there, I noticed that you had a question in the list earlier, but in the middle presentation. Was that question answered for you by the presentation? It's possibly that his question was answered by your presentation, maybe.
If there are any other questions, you can always hit me up on Twitter or something.
Okay then, if you want to leave it there then, Sahil, we can do that. Yeah. But no, thank you very much for a great presentation. It's an area that I'm actually trying to learn myself as well, because I'm more towards development of applications rather than the cloud-based solutions. But no, it's definitely learned a lot there myself. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we got a question. Okay.
Yes.
Can you integrate ThinkTexture with Azure AD? Yes. ThinkTexture, I think they're talking about the identity server. It's based on standard protocols. So anything that understands standard protocols can be integrated. Now, some people might also think of ThinkTexture as almost like well, this is stretching the definition a little bit, but it's almost like an on-premises Azure AD in some ways. Like, it won't integrate with third parties and third-party apps, etc., but it bridges protocols for you, and it's a very good product. And it's open source and all that. So you can actually start up with ThinkTexture on-premises, and if you're relying on that today, you can have Azure AD federate with ThinkTexture Identity Server. Totally possible. That was a good question.
Thank you very much, Sahil. Ladies and gentlemen, that's where we'll close it tonight. Thank you again for attending the session, and we hope to see Sahil again on our presentations again soon. Before you go, don't forget that Scott Guthrie will be returning for his 18th open questions and answer session on the 4th of August. Thank you very much to our sponsors, AuxWeb, Telerik, Inner Workings, Syncfusion, Pluralsight and Winterlect Now. Without their continued support, we won't be able to do what we do. And as Sahil has said, he is available online via Twitter if you have any more questions to ask him, or you can visit him on his blog. I'll leave those details on the screen for you now.